Welcome, everybody, to our Building with Brick podcast. It's Building with Brick, Foundational Wisdom on Coaching, Careers, and Christ. And today we've got just an outstanding guest, someone who personifies all three of those things. His name is Bob Seggerson, and I've known Bobby for quite some time. We were teammates in high school. He was the best player on our team our freshman, sophomore, and senior years. The only reason he wasn't his junior year is because we had an all-Ohio candidate that went to Dayton and was a hell of a player at Dayton. So I've asked Bobby to join us today. He's got quite a record as a coach, and I think he's got some real good things that he can share with us that would help young coaches and would also help people, I think, in the business world kind of put that two and two together. Bob's a member of the Ohio High School Basketball Coaches Hall of Fame. He had 518 wins in his career. Fantastic career. 71%, I think, was his winning percentage. He went to the Final Four 6 times. 5 of the times he lost. And we can talk a little bit about that and how that affects you. But those 5 losses were by 8 points. And I mean, that could crush most people. But he came back, and on his 518th win, it was in the state championship game. And you can't go out any better than that. And just this week, is a high school, or our high school, Lima Central Catholic High School in Lima, Ohio, named the court after him. And it was well-deserved. So, Bobby, welcome, and it's great to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here, Joe. Nice to talk to you.
Yeah. Bob, in the book I talk about, in my book, I talk about the competitive edge and where I got that as a player, and then later on, it wasn't only in athletics, it's in everything. You know, once you get that competitive edge, you just keep going for it. But where did you get yours? Because you had it. I mean, playing with you for those 4 years, you were a competitor extraordinaire.
Well, that's a good question. I don't think everybody's ever asked me that question, and I'm not sure where I got it. I think it was natural. I think I was probably born with it. I was in a large family. There were 9 kids in my family. My mother had 9 kids in 11 years. So it's an Irish steps, those 1, 2, 3. And so you can imagine the zoo in our house growing up. I was right in the middle. So I got a feeling that maybe some of that competitive edge was just simply in my birth order, being in the middle, trying to find a, space for yourself. My older brothers were not athletes. I was really the first one in my family to play athletics. But it was one of the things that really drew me to athletics was the competitive element. And that's probably the thing that I miss the most now, is just that idea of competition. Mm-hmm. And I think I coached because of that, because that's as close as I could get to actually competing, was standing on that sideline and watching other people compete, So I'm not sure where it came from, but you're right. I had it, and I had it, and it drove me not only as an athlete, but it also drove me as a coach.
That's interesting. You probably, part of it is probably who got the last pork chop. And
well, we had a big picnic table with benches. We didn't have a typical, and Mom would put my mother, who was a very bright woman. She had a master's in chemistry, and she was a bright woman. And then she met my dad, had 9 kids. So he put that food at the middle of the table, and it was a scramble every night.
I can't imagine that. We only had 4, and that was bad enough. But 2 of them were little girls, so they didn't eat much, and so it worked out for us. You ended up getting a scholarship, full scholarship, to St. Joseph's in Indiana, which was a really good Division II program. But I always wondered, and I've never asked you this, what was your dream college? Your senior year, I mean, you had a great senior year. You averaged 20 points a game, which you're probably in the top 10 in our school's history of people's per game average. So what college were you dreaming of?
I think like almost all the kids in our area, it was University of Dayton.
Yeah.
Because back in the day, there was only a couple of TV stations that you could even get into, and Dayton was one of them that we could. There were 3 channels we could get, and so we were watching Dayton basketball games. And actually, Don Donaher came to LCC my senior year in the springtime and sat down with me and offered me a half a scholarship. And being from a big family, I that wasn't enough. And later on, I understood that he actually offered a full scholarship to somebody else, which was part of mine. And it was George Jenke out of Chicago, Illinois, who went on to have a great career there. So he knew what he was doing. But Dayton was where I wanted to go.
Yeah.
I did have some other chances, and I had an offer from Niagara University.
Oh, yeah. And, you'd have played with Calvin Murphy.
Yeah, I could have played with Calvin.
Oh, you'd never seen the ball.
He would have never seen the ball if I got it. But but I also had in that age, I had 3 different offers from Florida schools. And as you remember, Joe, in the mid '60s, oftentimes Florida schools were coming up into Ohio and the Midwest to recruit because Florida was not a real hotbed of basketball. And more importantly, most of the schools were segregated. And so they were overlooking the great talent there. And since they had to recruit white talent, they were coming into Ohio to do that. And so there was a number of schools there. But in the end, St. Joe's was where I went largely because Father Herr just, I wanted to go to Niagara. But after my trip there that I took, he took me for a walk out behind LCC. And you know how Father Herr was the principal of Lima Central Catholic. And he was, you listen to him. And I remember we were walking in that back lot there, and I was telling him about this Niagara visit that I had just gone on. And I was treated very well there. And but he didn't like it. And he said, you need to go to St. Joe's in Indiana. And then he said, if you go to Niagara, you could flunk out. And that's all he had to say to me. I was not a very good student, as you recall. And that kind of scared me. And my older brother, John, and my brother, Ed, had both gone to St. Joseph's College. So I was familiar with it, and I liked it. And so that kind of cemented it for me. And I ended up going to St. John's. It was a smart move. I had a great career there, got a great education. And my mother was also responsible, Joe. I don't know if I've ever told you this story, but I was recruited by one coach in Florida who came to the house, sat down and really pitched my mom and dad and I. And when he showed us a book of, in those days, there was no videos or anything like that. It was just straight sales. And he had a little pamphlet with a lot of pictures in it. And I'm looking at these pictures and it's all these girls in bikinis, on every other book. And I'm thinking, man, I'm going here. And when he got done, my mom said, I got to ask you a couple of questions. And the first questions my mother asked his coach was, you didn't say much about academics. And he kind of gave his answer, but I could tell she wasn't real, happy with it. And then the second question she asked his coach was, we're Catholic and you're not a Catholic institution. And we're concerned about, my son being able to practice his faith. And he told her that there was a church right off campus and he would make sure I got there to mass every Sunday. And then he said, for some inexplicable reason, he ended by saying, I used to be Catholic myself.
Oh, no, probably the worst thing that you could say.
So then, I looked at that and I looked at my mom and she kind of gave me that eyeball and I'm going, no, come on. And then the last question she asked this coach was, are you segregated? And this coach looked at her and he kind of looked around the room, kind of gauged what she was really getting at. And I remember him distinctly saying, Mr. and Mrs. Seggerson, your son will never have to worry about rubbing shoulders with any colored boys. Oh, boy. And that was strike 3. Oh, because now I had 2 eyeballs looking at me. My dad and my mom were giving me this like stink eye. So I knew I wasn't going there. And so instead of, sitting on the beach and studying, I was sitting in the middle of cornfields in Rensselaer, Indiana at St. Joseph's College, which really was, my mom was absolutely right. That's where I belonged, right there.
So you don't have any regrets for
None.
not going to Niagara? Or...
No, not really. it was just a perfect situation for me. There was a couple other guys that came from LCC that year, classmates who went to St. Joe,
Yeah, I
Paul
remember
Sullivan and Dave O'Grady and a number of guys.
Yeah, I remember that.
And it was great basketball, Joe.
Yeah.
When I went to St. Joe, the Indiana Collegiate Conference was Evansville, Indiana State, Ball State, Butler, Valparaiso, St. Joe, and DePaul with a W. And that was our league, a tough league.
Yeah.
And
Well,
so,
Evansville, year in and year out, I mean, they
yeah,
had great teams, absolutely great. I mean, guys that played professionally came from
yeah,
Evansville.
right.
Yeah.
And it was always home and away. And one of the things I enjoyed about your book, Joe, so much was when you were talking about your experience at an all-boys school, you know, a Division II or an NAIA school, a very similar background to what I was doing. And so I was relating to a lot of what you were saying. And the only difference was you had a girls' college like down the street. There wasn't, St. Joe's was 2,500 boys, and there wasn't a girl within, 100 miles. So we would ship these girls in from girls' colleges. They would come in on buses. And those poor girls, when those buses would come rolling in, the guys would come out. We hadn't seen girls in months, and they would come driving down the street in these buses from all these different girls' colleges in Indiana and Illinois. And I just must think they must have looked out the window and thought, oh my God.
The animals.
But it was a great experience. It really was. And by my junior year, we actually went co-ed. And
Well, you did.
yeah, so junior and senior year, they brought girls on campus, which was kind of nice because we were the big, studs on campus then because our basketball team was pretty good then. We won the ICC my senior year. It was the first time that St. Joe had ever won. And we were eligible for the NCAA tournament, actually won the Midwest regional crown. We beat Central Michigan on their home court. And, it was just a great experience for me. That made it for me.
Yeah.
The experience of winning, Joe.
Yeah.
In fact, I remember, Joe, and you can relate to this. When we won that game against Central Michigan, we were not favored, but we torched them because we ran. And I remember coming home from that game. We were on a Greyhound bus. And I remember one of our teammates had one of those big boom boxes and he was playing, he was taping music. And one of them was a Tommy James and the Shondell Crystal Blue Persuasion. Okay.
Oh, yeah, I remember
So that song is playing. And I remember I was exhausted because we played 2 days in a row. And you know how you are after a good game. You're just exhausted. And I was sitting on that bus and it was the greatest feeling I ever had because I was just thinking, my God, we've won this game. We're on our way to the finals. It was just one of the highlights of my life athletically in terms of how I felt. And I think for nearly 40 years of coaching in high school, I think I chased that feeling.
Yeah.
I think that's what I chased. And I caught it. And I caught it in the last game I ever coached, which was a 2010 state championship in front of 14,700 fans at Schott Arena when we held on to win another tough game, but we won it. And so that's kind of was a motivation for me all the time. And I think a lot of athletes who have had that feeling, and I know you had it your first year at Benedictine when you guys won a national championship.
Right.
That feeling, that camaraderie when you're in a locker room and you got it going, and you got a team really going, that's like crack, man.
It really is. Yeah. Bob, the closest I came to that, and I relate so much to what you just said, because that's why I got back into coaching, was that feeling. I mean, there's nothing like it, being successful after working so hard to try to accomplish something. But the closest I came to it after that is when I was playing the AAU circuit after college, and we won the NABA national title. And it was similar. The feeling was similar because we won 3 games in 3 days at the Nationals by a total of 6 points. And it was just gutting it out, making the play when you had to make the play. And you just, when it's all done, you walk away and you go, God, that's great. So, yeah. Well, you were talking about your college experience. You had a pretty good coach at St. Joe. What'd you learn from him?
Well, he was a terrific coach. Jim Holstein was a great athlete himself. He actually had 2 NBA rings with the Minneapolis Lakers. He was a sixth man for the Minneapolis Lakers, and he actually played in the Milwaukee Brave um, minor league baseball circuit while he was playing. So he was a great athlete. Had gone to University of Cincinnati. In fact, Oscar Robertson had broken his scoring record. So
Okay.
the guy was a name, and I think what I learned from him, I didn't realize I had learned it until a lot later in life. Really, I think I became more like him. Now, when I played for him, he was a Bobby Knight type coach, and he's very, very disciplined, very tough, and just a tough guy to get to know. Not one of those guys you're going to go in and pull up a chair and sit down and talk to. But and so I had, and I didn't play as much as I thought I should be playing, as every athlete. And so I didn't play much until my junior and senior year. And but as I got older and started coaching, I just realized that he was such a big part of my own coaching, and I called him and I asked for advice on several occasions. So, specifically what I learned is probably his discipline, and the fact that there was just a little bit of a line between a coach and his players. You're not trying to be their buddy.
Right.
That's not one of the goals. You're not high-fiving them all the time. There are coaches that can do that, but he wasn't that type. But I really, it's one of those things where the older I got, the smarter he got. And there, and also, Joe, you know this too. There were also things he did that I said to myself, I would never do that. And the same thing with our high school coach. There were things that happened where I remember thinking, I wouldn't do this. And so sometimes you learn, what you wouldn't do from a coach, which can be just as valuable an experience for somebody as it is for, the positives you take from your experience playing for them.
Well, I agree with you 100%. 100%. I've been around coaches that with their Bobby Knight style. I don't like it. Some of the coaches that I had as assistant coaches were excellent coaches. And I just made sure that they were the right type of person to come in. If you come in and you start swearing at kids and, demeaning them all the time, that just doesn't work in my book. So I agree with what you're saying. Who were your other mentors?
Well, you go back to my youth, one of the guys that really got me to fall in love with basketball was a player by the name of Cleo Vaughn.
Oh yeah, I remember.
He was kind of a playground legend. He was about 10 years older, 12 years older than us. But he was also the first African American to scholarship to start and to score points for Ohio State University. And he was from Lima, and he came back and he was a fixture at Bradfield Center, which was like a proving ground in Lima. Yeah. And so he had a lot of effect on me. There was a senior in our school, Dan O'Shaughnessy, who picked me up and took me places. But it was really Cleo Vaughn who saw some talent in me, and he brought it out. In terms of coaching, in terms of mentoring, there was a coach at Kettering Alter in Dayton, Ohio, a famous coach by the name of Joe Petroselli, who coached probably 4 or 5 NBA players at a great school there called Kettering Alter. And he kind of took me under his wing. And the best thing that ever happened in my coaching career was I got an opportunity to work at 5-star basketball camp in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, at Robert Morris College. At the time, AAU had not ascended. Right. And the best players from on the East Coast all the way to the Mississippi, I would say, and sometimes all the way out, were coming to 5-star basketball camp. And Joe asked me to sub for him 1 week, and it was called Pit 2, the second week. And the best players in the country were coming in that week. And so my first week there, I got to know the director of the camp, a man named Howard Garfinkel, who a lot of people don't know, but he was kind of a godfather of scouting and camps and things like that. He had developed this into a great, great camp. Well, he took a shine to me, and he invited me back for almost 20 years to for a couple of weeks at 5-star. And the attraction at first for me was that all these great players. I coached a bunch of players that for a week or two that actually ended up in the NBA, and almost all the kids in camp would get a college scholarship somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So there were 3 levels: sophomores, juniors, and seniors. I was in the NBA, the seniors, and I'd have 10 players on my team. 8 or 9 of them would be scholarship players, 2 or 3 would be Division I. Well, that was fun. But what really impacted me were the other coaches. Coaches, when I first started there was 12 teams in the NBA, 6 high school coaches, and 6 assistant college coaches. So these colleges were desperately trying to get their coaching staffs into the 5-star, because for 2 weeks they could coach these great players. The NCAA eventually just kaput that, and it became all high school players. But the great coaches that I used to sit down with then for a couple of weeks at night, when you sit around the dorm room and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
My original roommate, the first roommate I had the first couple of years, was Seth Greenberg.
Oh,
Now,
good.
yeah, and he was a great guy, but he was just getting into the coaching business at that time at the college level. But we had a suite there with 4 rooms feeding onto a small lobby, like a little living room setup. And that was where a lot of coaches hung out then. We drink beers at night. But Dave Odom was a high school coach then. He went on to coach at Wake Forest. Frank Lapis became a really good friend. He, the next year, actually went on to the staff at Villanova. The mentor at 5-star for me was a guy named Brendan Malone, who was at Power Memorial High School, and then jumped into college, eventually coached the Cavs and the Pistons, and his son now is the coach of Denver. But Jerry Wainwright, Will Ray, these were guys who were high school coaches that kind of ascended that ladder. My favorite was Bob Wade, who coached at Baltimore Dunbar. And oh boy, I learned so much from Bob Wade. He jumped directly from Dunbar High School to Maryland for a couple years.
I remember that, yeah.
Constantly. And so being around those coaches, I remember the first year I took a kid from school named Bruce Hodges, who ended up playing at Sam Houston State, had a professional career in Spain. He played for me and I took him. So after a couple of weeks, we were driving home. It was just me and him in a car. And we were driving about 15 minutes into it. I looked at him and said, "Bruce, what did you learn at camp?" He goes, "I learned I'm not as good as I thought I was." And I looked at him, I said, "That's a hell of a lesson." Yeah. And because he was playing with all these great players. Yeah. And then I drove for about 2 minutes. I looked at him, I said, "I learned the same thing." Because I just watched so many great coaches. And at that time, they were bringing high school coaches in from Ohio and Chicago. And I just became great friends with a lot of these high school coaches. And just to be around them and in that environment, it was like osmosis. And this was 3 or 4 or 5 years into my career. And I used to often think, "Oh, I wish I'd had this knowledge 3 or 4 years ago," because I had great teams that didn't make it to state that I kept thinking, boy, if I'd had those kids again, maybe I could get them down there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in terms of mentoring, Bob Arnson, who was a great coach in the area, he mentored me. He was very close. I would call him on different occasions. Don Lane, I talked to several times, an old high school coach. But I think that the atmosphere and the knowledge that was being passed back and forth at 5-star was like basketball heaven, man. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was basketball heaven. You wouldn't believe the people that came in and out of that setting, and the players and the coaches, and just the speakers that would come in. Now, I was lucky enough the last 3 or 4 years I was there, I actually was a lecturer. I got to lecture the camp, which gave you a few extra dollars, not much with Garf. You were lucky. Coaches would pay to get into that camp. Yeah. Now it's kind of passed because in the middle 90s, AAU just ascended. Yeah. And so the great players were now going to Vegas, sitting in our hotel room, then playing 1 or 2 games. But 5-star was not like that. 5-star was a teaching camp. Hubie Brown was there all the time. Knight was there. They set up stations that people had to go through. And high school coaches got fired right and left in that camp by Garfinkel. And they got fired not because of what they were doing with the kids, because they weren't working at those stations. He really emphasized the teaching part of basketball. Mm-hmm. And some days I would take I would just go around and look at what other guys were doing, what coaches were doing, and they were working hard. I mean, they were really working at these kids. I can't tell you how much basketball I picked up just watching other coaches work in fundamental stations with their players. I was lucky, really lucky.
Well, in my book, I talk about that development phase of becoming a good coach. And one of my regrets is that I was never in a position to be an assistant coach and under somebody that really knew what they were doing. And I didn't go to a 5-star type thing, although I had every video I think that they ever created and, watched how they designed all their stations, things like that. But you were blessed to be able to have that type of an experience. But at the same time, I'm sure you were like a sponge. You can go to those things and you can walk away from them and not take anything home other than a big head because you were one of those. But you didn't do that. You walked away humbly and bringing with you things that you learned. So, and then using those things and implementing them into your program. So it's a real credit to Bob Seggerson, I think, for what you did accomplish. Bobby, I'm going to take a break here, if you don't mind, and we'll come back in a few minutes and we'll get into talking about college opportunities for you to coach since you had so many contacts. So let's take a short break and I'll be right back.
All right, Joe.
Okay.